quite right, that's okay. These are very similar terms and ideas. So I do want to spend some time in today's class unpacking them in a little bit more detail. So one of the models that we'll be coming back to a lot for today's class is this sort of Venn diagram that's put forth by Carl Rogers that gets into the idea of self-concept, which was one of the big ideas that we'll be unpacking for today and a good thing to have in your notes for today's class. So self-concept, right, gets into essentially what do we believe about ourselves? What about ourselves do we know to be true? And so on. And so self-concept, if we think about a concept, right, for instance, the concept of soccer involves different rules about, the ball, the goals, the way the teams are set up, the way the points are scored, and so on. The same way, the concept of you, the various characteristics and elements that make up yourself. So we'll be talking about these kind of three parts that link up together: self-image, self-worth, and ideal self, right? Self-image we can think about as this mirror. If we look in the mirror, what do we see? In other words, how do we view ourselves as a person? Self-worth, how do we evaluate or judge that? So do we see ourselves as being good or bad? And then an ideal self is essentially, in a perfect world, what do we look like? So one thing that's been kind of interesting has been to see a lot of apps that have changed our physical appearance. So for instance, there's a lot of the common gender swap or aging apps. There's also, some apps that maybe make you look younger, that, give you a lot more muscles, that change your appearance in some way. We think a lot about media and the ways that things such as, cover photos for magazines and fashion will oftentimes utilize photo editing, Photoshop, and so on, sometimes very poorly, right? And in order to create this idea of an ideal self. So one of the key ideas that's advanced here by Carl Rogers in how we engage in interpersonal communication is that these different elements of ourselves have to be congruent. In other words, there has to be this Venn diagram overlap between the different parts of who we are. This is because if we see a major gap in terms of our self-image, who we are and who we want to be, we're going to be frustrated. We're going to be at times depressed and angry that we're not able to be the best version of ourselves that we want to be, right? So for instance, if you feel really poorly about your physical appearance, then you're going to look at this ideal self and say, I'm never going to look like this. I'm never going to look like the way I did back in high school. I don't like this. And so we'll feel frustrated. But at the same time, there is a gap, right? We're not everything that we ideally would like to be, but we also know that, we're works in progress and we're growing as people. So there is some overlap there, right? Also overlap with self-worth, that if who we are and who we value are not very close to each other, we're going to be feeling frustrated as well. So self-worth, again, gets into the kind of judgment and evaluation that we have. If who we are right now, how we see ourselves is okay, we think to ourselves, okay, you know what? I had some good input and ideas when I was in my class earlier. I'm doing okay, right? Then we'll feel a lot better. You can think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is one of the ideas we brought up last week. So one of the big questions that we had last class, or last week's class, was, why do we use interpersonal communication? We use interpersonal communication to fill a lot of needs, right? Whether they're basic things like food, water, and shelter, or at the very top of the pyramid, self-actualization gets into becoming the best version of ourselves, exploring ideas and growing. And in order for us to be able to self-actualize, we need to have these things lined up. So that's something we'll talk a little bit more about and use a couple examples to contextualize for today. On Monday's class, we took a break from new ideas in interpersonal communication to focus on writing. So Monday's class is our major writing workshop. Even though your first major writing assignment isn't due until mid-November, I thought it would be a good way to set up, get you thinking about writing, and to help you start to brainstorm ideas for that essay, as well as help prepare for other classes. Some of the goals and ideas that you all had in your anonymous feedback were things like clarity, organization, structure, and so on. And so I hope that talking with other folks in the class and going through some of the ways that you can write essays effectively are useful for you. Again, the further out you start to plan and practice for your essay, the better shape you'll be in. And again, I'm happy to look at rough drafts, outlines, and so on. The rubric for that first assignment, the interpersonal analysis essay, is available on Canvas for any point that you'd like to look at it. We looked at some cases of good and bad writing. So again, we examined, passive voice, problems with citing sources appropriately, and so on. And then we also talked about some of the major assignments and resources available for the course. So one thing that I noticed as class was wrapping up was that there was a little bit of confusion about how to differentiate the different types of citation styles, right? So a lot of folks were a little bit unsure, MLA versus APA versus Chicago. One thing that I posted on Canvas shortly after class and in light of wanting to help you out further with that are some additional resources for different types of citation styles. So the University of Pittsburgh has a really great resource that goes through some different examples for both APA, MLA, and Chicago. So for instance, in APA, right, it shows you the material, such as a book, how you use an in-text citation with last name and date, and then also how you can use a bibliography or works cited. I think this is a really good way that you can get a visual here to help to understand those things. You'll also notice, right, that MLA is a little bit different. So rather than a comma, there's no comma here. It also doesn't include the year in the in-text citation. And the works cited at the end is a little bit different. It includes the full first name. It includes the year here at the very end, and so on. And then the Chicago style is generally the style that uses footnotes or endnotes. So you'll notice here, right, that you would include on things like Google Docs or Microsoft Word, there's a footnote or endnote feature. You can use that, and then at the bottom here, or at the end of the page, if you're using footnotes, it'll have that citation. The difference between footnotes and endnotes, right, is that the footnote comes at the end of the page, whereas the endnote comes at the end of the entire document. So that's just some additional help for these different formats. Again, choose the format you're the most comfortable with, that you'd like to work on the most, or the one that you use for other classes. So if you say, you know what, I've got two other classes that both require MLA, I'm going to use MLA for this class, great. You'll become an expert in MLA. So definitely refer to this if you'd like some additional help with different citation styles. Again, I'm happy to look at your drafts and help you out if you need any additional assistance on that. Does anybody have any questions about anything we talked about last class or anything about the course in general at this time? It's morning, we're all adjusting and acclimating to the day. And so if you don't have a question right now, that's okay. Feel free to pose that later. But at any point in the class, feel free to interrupt me, and I'm happy to answer or clarify anything for you. So for this class, let's talk a little bit more about interpersonal communication, including the way that we engage in self-evaluation and perception, including our self-perception. And then we'll also look at the role of personality, which was brought up toward the end of your reading, right? There's a lot of personality tests and ways to evaluate personality out there, but there's also a lot of critiques of personality tests and some of the reduction of ourselves to a certain series of traits that can come out from that. So, just kind of as a way to recap and think about, the top of the pyramid of different types of audiences and communication. What is interpersonal communication?
Communication you have with yourself, it's like the self-dialect.
Yeah. I like the way you bring up the self-dialect, right? Because we think back to dialectic all the way back to Aristotle and Socrates, and it's this idea that we discover the truth by two people talking with one another. We uncover and learn more and more. The same way, you're having this dialogue with yourself, right? You're learning more about who you are because you're constantly thinking through, and in a lot of situations, right, overthinking. If you've ever seen a TV show or a movie that has the classic like shoulder angel and shoulder devil, right? That's an example of interpersonal communication. It's using kind of a visual representation of like your good and your bad side and which side is going to win over and decide what you do. And that's one example of interpersonal communication. We have conflicts about whether we do the right thing or the thing we think is good to other people or the thing that's selfish and benefits ourselves more, right? So we make evaluations like that. Interpersonal communication also runs through a spectrum. So one thing we talked about earlier in the class is that interpersonal communication can be everything from thinking to talking out loud, right? So maybe you're singing in the car because you know that you're going to speak in front of a large group, or you're just working on your anxiety, right? That can also fit under interpersonal communication. And it's something that crosses over into a lot of the hard sciences, including biology. A lot of folks in science have examined interpersonal communication as a very human behavior. It's something that we actively do and is a normal thing that assists in our growth as people. What's that?
Psychology.
Yeah, psychology looks into interpersonal communication as well, right? There's a lot of benefits that we have from that interpersonal communication process. So it happens within that person's self or in their mind, right? So it can be this dialogue that's going on in your head. Oh, did I remember everything today? Or did I leave, my laptop at home? That going on in your mind, you're talking to yourself. So that tends to be a more external and verbal way that you're doing that. Maybe you're looking in the mirror and saying, you know what? I am feeling good today. So some people might use things like affirmations as a way to positively speak about themselves and get kind of in a good headspace for the day. So again, interpersonal communication follows under a spectrum, whether it's just in your mind, just in your head, and it's very internal, or whether you're actively speaking to yourself, in which case it's external, right? And one of the reasons that interpersonal communication is so valuable is because communication is how we figure out who the heck we are, right? Imagine if we lived in a society where we did not have language and we did not have the ability to communicate. You look in the mirror, you have no frame of reference to figure out something like your skin color, your height, what your eyes look like, whether or not you have acne, how long your hair is, right? You might visually see different things, but you wouldn't have the ability to develop them into concepts that make us who we are. One of, I think, the most interesting and unfortunately distressing things have been studies of people who have basically been locked in a basement or locked in a closet for almost all of their lives. And when people are rescued and brought out of that situation, they have a uniquely difficult time developing their self-concept because not having access to language and socialization, figuring out and determining your personality is a lot harder. You don't even have words to describe the internal dialogue that you've been creating. Another thing that's really interesting have been anumeric indigenous groups. So it was discovered that there was a major indigenous group, I believe near the Amazon River, who have words to describe the numbers 1, 2, and 3, but beyond that do not have words to describe larger quantities of items, because that's not something that this tribe does on a regular basis. They don't have large quantities of items that they have to move around. So for instance, members of this group were asked to identify the difference between 4 sticks that were stacked together and 5 sticks, and did not have the words to describe that difference. So it's really interesting for us to think about how communication is shaping our perception, including the perception and evaluation that we have over ourselves. Right? And we can think about this cycle that's talked about in your chapter as contributing to the self-esteem and self-judgment that we make, right? We communicate, maybe we communicate with ourselves, we say, oh hey, I'm looking pretty good today, right? Through that communication, you're boosting your self-esteem, you're feeling better and more confident. And maybe you decide, you know what, in the car, I'm just going to sing along to a silly song. And so that in turn, right, boosts your self-esteem, boosts your communication, and so on. So interpersonal communication involves both evaluation and judgment that we make over ourselves, right? Evaluation means that we look at these different elements of who we are, we put them all together, right? We say, okay, this is who I am in the mirror. You render a judgment or a subjective interpretation and say, okay, I'm looking pretty good today. I'm doing pretty well. So again, evaluation and judgment play a major role here. One thing that we can think about as a really big example of this are a lot of kind of classic teen, coming of age, comedy type films. How many folks have seen films like Mean Girls? Yeah, so several of you, right? A lot of these types of films look into the ways that people's personalities and characteristics develop over time, right? A lot of these films are in high school, which is a very mean, spirited situation for a lot of people because we have a lot of name calling, we have a lot of people that are trying to figure out who they are, and so on. So one example that I want to talk about is one of these types of classic teen comedy type films. It's called The Duff with Mae Whitman. I don't know how many folks have seen this, but it's a very kind of classic example of a show that uses this kind of teen coming of age setting as a way to develop personality. But I particularly wanted to choose this example because I think it has really interesting implications for communication and self-concept. So I'm going to show you an example, clip from this film that I think helps us to understand a little bit of interpersonal communication. Somebody mentioned Superbad. Yeah. That's another case, right, where you have these two like teenage guys who are interested in developing romantic relationships, who want to develop and understand themselves as people, right? And over the course of the film, they start to form these kind of relationships and different values that we have over time, right? There's a lot of different examples. 10 Things I Hate About You is a classic example too. Even going back to like Shakespeare era, Romeo and Juliet, Taming of the Shrew, and so on. There's a lot of classic cases of that too.
Let's talk about labels. The classics still exist. Jock, geek, rocker, mean girl. Sorry. But what I didn't know was I had a brand new label.
We're your girls now.
It's actually not my job to give you intel on my best friends.
It kind of is, though, as their Duff.
Sorry, as their what?
Duff. D-U-F-F. Designated ugly fat friend.
What did you just say to me?
Every group of friends has one. The one who doesn't look as good, thus making their friends look better. The one who's easy to talk to because no one's trying to get with them. You friended up. Good talk.
How could you guys not tell me that I was your Duff? I what?
Oh, no, you did. I didn't say it. Yes, you did.
I don't want to be anybody's Duff. I want to be the dateable one. I will make sure you pass science if you help me with this.
Well, you got the easy part. After reverse Duff, you are you wearing pajamas?
If I wanted to go shopping, I could have done that with Jess and Casey. I need you to give me real talk.
You got a uniboob, your posture sucks. You need to start dressing less like Wreck-It Ralph. Boom, real talk.
People like you will never matter here.
You need to realize you're only as awesome as you think you are.
I have a date. Told you that.
You do. You don't?
Stop.
Question?
It's important.
What do you want?
Come on, please.
Right, so obviously a very mean phrase to use to describe somebody, right? But one of the things that's brought up immediately in the trailer is the idea of labels and the ways that labels can be internalized to define who people are. And it goes back to that cycle that we just mentioned, right, where communication impacts self-esteem, which impacts communication, and on and on and on, right? So this term, designated ugly fat friend, is used onto Mae Whitman's character, and in a very insulting way, right? She is taken aback, she feels negatively about it, but she kind of uses that to rethink and reevaluate the relationships that she has with her friends. She says, oh wow, I don't feel valued very much as a person, and that's really negatively affecting her self-esteem, right? You can think about the other labels that are put on characters, like, a jock or a mean girl type character, and that oftentimes, right, is placed on by other people, but we internalize and use that to define ourselves. So communication is used in order to form evaluations of our own self-worth. So for her character, right, that phrase is seen as a really bad thing. It's seen as being devalued, being called, ugly and not treated very well, right? And it creates an incongruity with her self-image, right? So earlier on, she seems like she's doing okay. She has good relationships with friends. This label gets used to describe her, and it causes this sudden doubt about who she is as a person and the relationships that she has with other people, right? So oftentimes, when we hear gossip, when things like cyberbullying, insults, and so on happen, we feel this incongruity and frustration. We think, hey, we're not doing too bad, we're okay as people, and then, her friend just says, oh, you're dead, right? And because of that language and phrasing, that kind of shock and incongruity happens, damages her self-worth and self-esteem, so on. So again, there are tons of films and TV shows that are absolutely examples of this, but I thought the use of communication, language, and labels here was a way to help us to make sense of these different elements of evaluation. So for self-concept, right, as we talked about, again, it has these three parts. Self-image, self-worth, and an ideal self. So let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. So self-image, right, is something that I essentially asked you to do last week. So for those of you who were here last week and had the chance to do that activity, I just asked you to use a few words to describe who you are. And those words that you might have used, hardworking, athlete, outgoing, open-minded, right? Those all fit in terms of our own self-image. And again, I like to think about self-image in terms of what do you see when you look in the mirror, right? How do you know who you are? So self-image is the view that we have of ourselves. It's not a judgment. It's not an evaluation, good or bad. It's just saying, who is this person that I see? What are the things that I think are true or false about this person? So if you say, again, wow, I look great in this outfit, then that's kind of looking at that image and then rendering that kind of judgment. And one thing, right, is that because we're in this kind of first-person view all the time, unless we're looking in the mirror, we don't fully see ourselves as we're walking around and talking and so on. But in our heads, we have an idea of what we look like and what it might look like to the other person to see us. So, you look in the mirror, you get a sense of how you're doing in the day, and so on. Secondarily is this idea of self-worth, which again is more about the value that you place on yourself. One way that we oftentimes use self-worth is when we ask ourselves, am I a good person, right? So self-worth is looking at the different labels and things that we use and making that judgment. In the film example, right, the main character looks at that term used to describe her, right, the dumb, ugly, fat friend, and says, that tells me that I'm a bad person because society has told me, based on certain conventions of beauty and body image and so on, that being this set of things is bad, right? We see a lot of discussions surrounding identity, body positivity, and so on that impact our self-worth, right? To what degree do we see certain elements of who we are as good or bad? And that's something that varies a lot depending on cultures, right? In some cultures, being a larger size is attributed to kind of greater wealth and value as a person and is seen more positively. Whereas in places such as the United States, although we've definitely seen some cultural shifts, right, body image, weight, and size oftentimes is associated differently. So an ideal self, I think this is a good kind of image to describe it, right? You have a pawn chess piece, but in the mirror, right, it wants to be a queen or wants to be a king. And that's a good way to think about that, right? If we could be whoever we wanted to be, what would that look like? Who would we want to be, right? One really good example of this is if you've seen the superhero film Shazam, right? This is kind of a young boy who desires to grow up and be older, and he gets this kind of superhero power where he like becomes an adult, right? And is able to have this super strength and all of that, but also be taken seriously in a way that he doesn't feel like he can be as a kid. That's a good example of an ideal self. It's who you would like to be. And again, if we see a huge gulf and gap between who we are and who we'd like to be, we're going to feel like we cannot self-actualize or be this ideal. One of the things that really affects our self-worth and value as humans is agency. If we feel like we have the ability and power to grow as a person, then we tend to feel a lot better overall. Put all those things together, right, and we look at self-esteem. Again, it's a subjective evaluation that we have of our abilities, our limitations, who we are as a person, and so on. So the key words to break down here are subjective and evaluation. Subjective and subjectivity is essentially the opposite of objectivity, right? Objectivity would say, this is how things are, this is a table, this exists. Subjective would be to say, oh, this table has a really nice wood pattern, right? Or, this podium here is chipped in the corner. So subject is more based on the judgment, not necessarily based on facts. And that's a really big problem, because for a lot of us, we are our own worst critics. We're really hard on ourselves and really self-critical because we don't necessarily look at ourselves in an objective way. We look at ourselves subjectively in a warped perception of who we might think we are, right? Oh, I must have been an absolute idiot today. I must have been really weird. People don't like me. But an evaluation, again, is giving that judgment and essentially rendering, am I a good person or not? So self-esteem is making that kind of judgment based on your self-image, your self-worth, and your ideal self. What I'd like us to do for today as kind of a short attendance activity is I'd like us to take a few minutes to kind of apply and use this model. So I'd like you to think back if you were here last week and were able to do that personality thing where you had a few words to describe yourself. You can think back or refer back to that. You can also think about some additional words that maybe came to mind after completing that. But what I'd like you to do is divide some of these words that you would use to describe yourself into 3 different categories. In terms of self-worth, ideal self, and self-image. You can, if you have a sheet of paper, right, you can write out the circles, sort of a Venn diagram if you want to. Or you can also, especially if you're typing, right, you can list them out. And as you're writing and working on this, I want you to take note of whether or not you see these things overlapping with each other, right? So for instance, maybe you're an athlete and you feel really good about your physical shape. You might say, both in terms of your ideal self and your self-image, right, that you were strong. Or maybe your ideal self, right, has long hair, but that's not where you're currently at. So as you're thinking about the words that you might use to describe yourself, think about which of those categories it might fit into. I'll give you a little bit of time to work on that. It's not something that I'm going to require you to, share with other people, but it's a way for us to think about how these concepts can relate to our identity. We'll give folks another minute or two on this. Okay, go ahead and finish up the current thought or idea you're writing. I'll give you, from now until the end of class if there's any last changes or additions you want to make. But I will ask to grab it on your way out for attendance for today. So, one of the things that you might have noticed is that there's probably a lot of overlap in some of these sections. So we're forever works in progress. So maybe, you think to yourself, hey, I am feeling pretty confident, but I want to become more confident. I want to have greater good feelings over the course of my life, right? So oftentimes we find ourselves in this kind of in-between place where we've made some progress, but we're not all the way to our goal, whether it's a personal fitness type goal, personality goal, and so on. One other thing that I think is important to think about as we're examining these categories of our identities and the labels that have been placed on us is to understand that a lot of these labels are not fixed, right? They change over time. We not only grow and change as people, right? The quest for identity is the modern pilgrimage, but it's the idea that the way that we assign value to certain labels has changed over time. One really good example of this is the word queer, right? So kind of started a very neutral way to describe somebody being happy. It was used oftentimes, and at times it's still used, in a derogatory way to describe folks who might identify in the LGBTQ plus community. And in more recent years, we've seen it being used in a more reclaiming and positive way, right? Somebody might choose to identify themselves as queer as a positive way to describe who they are. So a lot of the ways that our terms and values on those terms use change can be really important. So we can understand that reclaiming, using value differently over time can play a really big role here. So one major idea that's talked a lot about in terms of English, communication, and this area known as performance studies, it relates pretty closely to English, psychology, sociology, so on. But it's this idea that we're constantly engaging in a sort of performance every single day of our lives. And we're in this performance whether we like it or not. So for instance, maybe we are performing through the clothing that we wear. What does it represent? What does it symbolize? What version of ourselves do we want to share? Right? We're constantly performing an expression of gender. Whether we like it or not, other people are reading and coding who we are. So performance ties to this idea of the looking glass self. That we imagine, as I mentioned before, you are gauging day to day. You don't fully understand how you're looking to other people since you're in that first person view through your eyes, right? We use imagination to to reflect on our performances. We think, this is probably how I'm sounding right now. Maybe I'm rattling on to a friend and being really silly. We imagine what other people think of us. We do this all the time. Oh, you must think that I'm really weird because I'm talking so much. And then lastly, we react to this imagination. So we might make a judgment, good or bad, on how we think we are coming across to other people. We're constantly performing, we're interacting with other people, we're behaving, we're expressing who we are, right? And so we're using that looking glass self, imagining what we look like to other people. This is why at times it might be cringy or uncomfortable to hear yourself speaking. Like if there's a recording of your own voice, we oftentimes kind of bristle at that, right? Self-compassion, which is an idea that was one of the options, right? It was not one of the three major elements that was brought up in the quiz today, but it is a way to help us with dealing with our self-esteem and self-value. It's about, we're our own worst critics, and if we apply the same level of respect and kindness, we're doing our best, we're interested in getting to know other people, we're not super judgmental, and we apply it to ourselves too, that can help a lot. One thing that's brought up in this chapter is the idea of the vulture, right? It's hanging over our heads. It's the thing that's oftentimes saying really mean things about ourselves every single day. So combating that is an important way that we can boost our self-value and self-esteem. So I want to kind of wrap up by touching a little bit on personality. I'll say that the elements of self-concept that were brought up in this chapter, I think, are a much bigger thing to focus on rather than personality, since there's a lot of different tests and ways to evaluate personality, and I think a lot of those have their problems, right? So personality can be measured or thought of in a lot of different ways, but the best way to sum it up is to say personality is essentially what makes you you. How, and when you think about personality, you're thinking about it in a comparative way. So if you say that you're outgoing, well, you're comparing yourself to other people that might be more introverted and less talkative. We know who we are because we know who we're not. One classic example here is the Myers-Briggs personality test, right, which looks at a lot of different elements to form this kind of 4x4 quadrant of personality. Some people might consider themselves to be introverted, extroverted. They could look at thinking versus feeling, right? Judgment might play a role as well. There's a lot of these kind of different measures, and that's one major personality test. There's a lot of different ways that we might come to know or understand our personality. Again, it ties back to that looking glass self. If you're imagining what you look like to other people, what does that mean, right? We might know our personality from our friends. So our friends say we're super outgoing, we're very talkative, we feel the same. Personality tests. So a lot of times when we complete a personality test, we think to ourselves, wow, this is who I am, this speaks to me, right? I found out I was an INFJ on the Myers-Briggs, and I was like, okay, this explains a lot. I'm pretty withdrawn, but I also care a lot about a lot of important current events and other types of issues. So you might use that as a way to describe yourself. Oftentimes, in terms of things like dating or friendships, you might use that as a way to describe your personality too. Folks who feel strongly about astrological signs, right, will oftentimes integrate that approach as well into their personality. Oh, I'm such a Scorpio, look out. Family, right? Our family might help to assign or label or define us. You can think again back to that example from the film about how different labels like jock, nerd, and so on get used to describe other people. Happens in our dating and relationships. We come to know somebody else who knows us pretty well. Our reputation, especially for a lot of celebrities and famous figures. So if you're reading a listicle about the 10 kindest actors that are a pleasure to work with, you might use that to evaluate their personality. And again, things like social media activity play a really big role as well. How is somebody behaving on social media? We use a lot of terminology, right? We say, oh, somebody's basic, they've got their pumpkin spice latte. We're making a judgment about their character based on their social media activity, right? For better or for worse. So there's a lot of different ways to measure and evaluate personality that are brought up in this chapter. You don't need to know all of them word for word, but things like the Ocean personality test, the idea of locus of control. Are you in control of your own life, or do other people control your life? Other factors, so this idea of agency. And again, self-esteem and our own evaluation of ourselves plays a big role here. So to recap, the major things that we went over for today, we talked about how interpersonal communication is about dialogue and relationship with yourself, whether it's just thinking or it's actually speaking to yourself. It involves self-concept and the judgments that we make about ourselves because of the labels that other people might put on us, and the labels that we come to internalize and use to describe who we are. And interpersonal communication connects to our personality. Our characteristics are things that we might assign to ourselves based on our friendships, our relationships, and so on. So for Friday, the syllabus quiz is on Canvas. I'm going to ask you to complete that by the end of the day on Friday. Just goes over a lot of the main elements of the course we've discussed before. Please read pages 101 to 110 of Wrench. This gets into interpersonal communication and social media and online areas, right? You might ask yourself, how does mediated communication impact our self-concept? So that's what we'll be getting into for tomorrow. If you're new to the class, I definitely recommend getting in touch with me, setting up a time to meet so that I can help catch you up on things that you might have missed. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your morning. Hopefully the drizzle is gone. And I will see you all again on Friday. Make sure to